understanding that night. Or, as Athena would have said, of believing. Andrea McCain, actress. Of course I'm to blame. If it hadn't been for me, Athena would never have come to the theatre that morning, gathered us all together, asked us to lie down on the stage and begin a relaxation exercise involving breathing and bringing our awareness to each part of the body. Relax your thighs. We all obeyed, as if we were before a goddess, someone who knew more than all of us, even though we'd done this kind of exercise hundreds of times before. We were all curious to know what would come after. Now relax your face and breathe deeply. Did she really think she was teaching us anything new? We were expecting a lecture, a talk, but I must control myself. Let's get back to what happened then. We relaxed, and then came a silence that left us completely disoriented. When I discussed it with my colleagues afterward, we all agreed that we felt the exercise was over, that it was time to sit up and look around, except that no one did. We remained lying down in a kind of enforced meditation for 15 interminable minutes. Then she spoke again. You've had plenty of time to doubt me now. One or two of you looked impatient. But now I'm going to ask you just one thing. When I count to 3, be different. I don't mean be another person, an animal, or a house. Try to forget everything you've learned in drama courses. I'm not asking you to be actors and to demonstrate your abilities. I'm asking you to cease being human and to transform yourselves into something you don't know. We were all still lying on the floor with our eyes closed, and so couldn't see how anyone else was reacting. Athena was playing on that uncertainty. I'm going to say a few words and you'll immediately associate certain images with those words. Remember that you're all full of the poison of preconceived ideas, and that if I were to say fate, you would probably start imagining your lives in the future. If I were to say red, you would probably make some psychoanalytic interpretation. That isn't what I want. As I said, I want you to be different. She couldn't explain what she really wanted. When no one complained, I felt sure they were simply being polite, but that when the lecture was over, they would never invite Athena back. They would even tell me that I'd been naive to have sought her out in the first place. The first word is sacred. So as not to die of boredom, I decided to join in the game. I imagined my mother, my boyfriend, my future children, a brilliant career. Make a gesture that means sacred. I folded my arms over my chest, as if I were embracing all my loved ones. I found out later that most people opened their arms to form a cross, and that one of the women opened her legs as if she were making love. Relax again, and again forget about everything, and keep your eyes closed. I'm not criticizing, but from what I saw, you seem to be giving form to what you consider to be sacred. That isn't what I want. When I give you the next word, don't try to define it as it manifests itself in the world. Open all the channels and allow the poison of reality to drain away. Be abstract, and then you will enter the world I'm guiding you toward. That last phrase had real authority, and I felt the energy in the theatre change. Now the voice knew where it wanted to take us. She was a teacher now, not a lecturer. Earth, she said. Suddenly I understood what she meant. It was no longer my imagination that mattered, but my body in contact with the soil. I was the earth. Make a gesture that represents earth. I didn't move. I was the soil of that stage. Perfect, she said. None of you moved. For the first time, you all experienced the same feeling. Instead of describing something, you transformed yourself into an idea. She fell silent again. for what I imagined were 5 long minutes. The silence made us feel lost, unable to tell whether she simply had no idea how to continue, or if she was merely unfamiliar with our usual intense rhythm of working. "I'm going to say a 3rd word," she paused. "Center." I felt, and this was entirely unconscious, that all my vital energy went to my navel, where it glowed yellow. This frightened me. If someone touched it, I could die. "Make a gesture for center." Her words sounded like a command. I immediately placed my hands on my belly to protect myself. "Perfect," said Athena. "You can sit up now." I opened my eyes and saw the extinguished stage lights up above me, distant and dull. I rubbed my face and got to my feet. I noticed that my colleagues looked surprised. "Was that the lecture?" asked the director. "You can call it a lecture if you like." "Well, thank you for coming. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have to start rehearsals for the next play." "But I haven't finished yet." "Oh, perhaps another time?" Everyone seemed confused by the director's reaction. After some initial doubts, I think we were enjoying the session. It was different. No pretending to be things or people, no visualizing apples or candles, no sitting in a circle holding hands as if we were practicing some sacred ritual. It was simply something slightly absurd, and we wanted to know where it would take us. Without a flicker of emotion, Athena bent down to pick up her bag. At that moment, we heard a voice from the stalls. "Marvellous." Heron had come to join her. The director was afraid of him because Heron knew the theatre critics on his newspaper and had close ties with the media generally. "You stopped being individuals and turned into ideas. What a shame you're so busy. But don't worry, Athena, we'll find another group to work with, and then I can see how your lecture ends. I have contacts." I was still thinking about the light travelling through my whole body to my navel. Who was that woman? Had my colleagues experienced the same thing? "Just a moment," said the director, aware of the look of surprise on everyone's face. "I suppose we could postpone rehearsals today." "No, you mustn't do that. Besides, I have to get back to the newspaper and write something about this woman. You carry on doing what you always do. I've just found an excellent story." If Athena felt lost in that debate between the 2 men, she didn't show it. She climbed down from the stage and went off with Heron. We turned to the director and asked him why he'd reacted like that. "With all due respect, Andrea, I thought the conversation in the bar about sex was far more interesting than the nonsense we've just been engaging in." "Did you notice how she kept falling silent? She didn't know what to do next." "But I felt something strange," said one of the older actors. "When she said center, it was as if all my vital energy were suddenly focused in my navel. I've never experienced that before." "Did you? Are you sure?" asked an actress, and judging by her words, she'd experienced the same thing. "She's a bit of a witch, that woman," said the director, interrupting the conversation. "Let's get back to work." We started doing our usual stretching exercises, warm-ups and meditation, all strictly by the book. Then after a few improvisations, we went straight into a read-through of the new script. Gradually, Athena's presence seemed to be dissolving, and everything was returning to what it was, a theatre, a ritual created by the Greeks thousands of years ago, where we were used to pretending to be different people. But that was pure play acting. Athena wasn't like that, and I was determined to see her again, especially after what the director had said about her. Heron Ryan, journalist. Unbeknownst to Athena, I'd followed exactly the same steps as the actors, obeying everything she told us to do, except that I kept my eyes open so that I could follow what was happening on stage. The moment she said, "Make a gesture for center," I placed my hand on my navel, and to my surprise I saw that everyone, including the director, had done the same. What was going on? That afternoon I had to write a dreary article about a visiting head of state, a real drag. In order to amuse myself between phone calls, I decided to ask colleagues in the office what gesture they would make if I said the word centre. Most of them made jokey comments about political parties. One pointed to the centre of the earth. Another put his hand on his heart. But no one, absolutely no one, thought of their navel as the centre of anything. In the end, though, I managed to speak to someone who had some interesting information on the subject. When I got home, Andrea had had a bath, laid the table, and was waiting for me to start supper. She opened a bottle of very expensive wine, filled 2 glasses, and offered me one. "So how was supper last night?" How long can a man live with a lie? I didn't want to lose the woman standing there before me, who had stuck with me through thick and thin, who was always by my side when I felt my life had lost meaning and direction. I loved her, but in the crazy world into which I was blindly plunging, my heart was far away, trying to adapt to something it possibly knew but couldn't accept, being large enough for 2 people. Since I would never risk letting go of a certainty in favour of a mere possibility, I tried to minimise the significance of what had happened at the restaurant, mainly because nothing had happened, apart from an exchange of lines by a poet who had suffered greatly for love. Athena's a difficult person to get to know. Andrea laughed. "That's precisely why men must find her so fascinating. She awakens that rapidly disappearing protective instinct of yours." Best to change the subject. I've always been convinced that women have a supernatural ability to know what's going on in a man's soul. They're all witches. I've been looking into what happened at the theatre today. You don't know this, but I had my eyes open throughout the exercises. You've always got your eyes open. I assume it's part of being a journalist. And you're going to talk about the moment when we all did exactly the same thing. We talked a lot about that in the bar after rehearsals. A historian told me about a Greek temple where they used to predict the future. Editor's note: the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, and which housed a marble stone called the navel. Stories from the time describe Delphi as the centre of the planet. I went to the newspaper archives to make a few inquiries. In Petra, in Jordan, there's another conic navel, symbolising not just the centre of the planet, but also of the entire universe. Both navels try to show the axes through which the energy of the world travels, marking in a visible way something that is only there on the invisible map. Jerusalem is also called the navel of the world, as is an island in the Pacific Ocean, and another place I've forgotten now because I had never associated the 2 things. Like dance. What? Nothing. No, I know what you mean. Belly dancing, the oldest form of dance recorded, in which everything revolves about the belly. I was trying to avoid the subject because I told you that in Transylvania I saw Athena dance. She was dressed, of course, but all the movements began with her navel and gradually spread to the rest of the body. She was right. Best to change the subject again and talk about the theatre, about boring journalistic stuff, then drink a little wine and end up in bed making love while outside the rain was starting to fall. I noticed that at the moment of orgasm, Andrea's body was all focused on her belly. I'd seen this many times before, but had never thought anything of it. Antoine Loucadour, historian. Heron started spending a fortune on phone calls to France, asking me to get all the information I could by the weekend. And he kept going on about the navel, which seemed to me the least interesting and least romantic thing in the world. But then, the English don't see things in the same way as the French. And so, instead of asking questions, I tried to find out what science had to say on the subject. I soon realized that historical knowledge wasn't enough. I could locate a monument here, a dolmen there, but the odd thing was that the ancient cultures all seemed to agree on the subject and even use the same word to define the places they considered sacred. I'd never noticed this before, and I started to get interested. When I saw the number of coincidences, I went in search of something that would complement them: human behavior and beliefs. I immediately had to reject the first and most logical explanation, that we are nourished through the umbilical cord, which is why the navel is, for us, the center of life. The psychologist immediately pointed out that the theory made no sense at all. Man's central idea is always to cut the umbilical cord, and from then on, the brain or the heart become the more important symbols. When we are interested in something, everything around us appears to refer to it. The mystics call these phenomena signs, the skeptics coincidence, and psychologists concentrated focus, although I've yet to find out what term historians should use. One night, my adolescent daughter came home with a navel piercing. Why did you do that? Because I felt like it. A perfectly natural and honest explanation, even for a historian who needs to find a reason for everything. When I went into her room, I saw a poster of her favorite female pop star. She had a bare midriff, and in that photo on the wall, her navel did look like the center of the world. I phoned Heron and asked why he was so interested. For the first time, he told me about what had happened at the theater and how the people there had all responded to a command in the same spontaneous, unexpected manner. It was impossible to get any more information out of my daughter, and so I decided to consult some specialists. No one seemed very interested until I found Francois Shepka, an Indian psychologist. Editor's note: the scientist requested that his name and nationality be changed, who was starting to revolutionize the therapies currently in use. According to him, the idea that traumas could be resolved by a return to childhood had never got anyone anywhere. Many problems that had been overcome in adult life resurfaced, and grown-ups started blaming their parents for failures and defeats. Shepka was at war with the various French psychoanalytic associations, and the conversation about absurd subjects like the navel seemed to relax him. He warmed to the theme, but didn't at first tackle it directly. He said that, according to one of the most respected psychoanalysts in history, the Swiss analyst Carl Gustav Jung, we all drank from the same spring. It's called the soul of the world. However much we try to be independent individuals, a part of our memory is the same. We all seek the ideal of beauty, dance, divinity, and music. Society, meanwhile, tries to define how these ideals should be manifested in reality. Currently, for example, the idea of beauty is to be thin, and yet, thousands of years ago, all the images of goddesses were fat. It's the same with happiness. There are a series of rules, and if you fail to follow them, your conscious mind will refuse to accept the idea that you are happy. Jung used to divide individual progress into 4 stages. The first was the persona, the mask we use every day, pretending to be who we are. We believe that the world depends on us, that we are wonderful parents, that our children don't understand us, that our bosses are unfair, that the dream of every human being is never to work and to travel constantly. Many people realize that there's something wrong with this story, but because they don't want to change anything, they quickly drive the thought from their head. A few do try to understand what is wrong and end up finding the shadow. The shadow is our dark side, which dictates how we should act and behave. When we try to free ourselves from the persona, we turn on a light inside us and we see the cobwebs, the cowardice, the meanness. The shadow is there to stop our progress, and it usually succeeds, and we run back to what we were before we doubted. However, some do survive this encounter with their own cobwebs, saying, yes, I have a few faults, but I'm good enough and I want to go forward. At this moment, the shadow disappears and we come into contact with the soul. By soul, Jung didn't mean soul in the religious sense. He speaks of a return to the soul of the world, the source of all knowledge. Instincts become sharper, emotions more radical. The interpretation of science becomes more important than logic. Perceptions of reality grow less rigid. We start to struggle with things to which we are unaccustomed, and we start to react in ways that we ourselves find unexpected. And we discover that if we can channel that continuous flow of energy, we can organize it around a very solid center, what Jung calls the wise old man for men and the great mother for women. Allowing this to manifest itself is dangerous. Generally speaking, anyone who reaches this stage has a tendency to consider themselves a saint, a tamer of spirits, a prophet. A great deal of maturity is required if someone is to come into contact with the energy of the wise old man or the great mother. Jung went mad, said my friend, when he had explained the 4 stages described by the Swiss psychoanalyst. When he got in touch with his wise old man, he started saying that he was guided by a spirit called Philemon. And finally, we come to the symbol of the navel. Not only people, but societies too fit these 4 stages. Western civilization has a persona, the ideas that guide us. In its attempt to adapt to changes, it comes into contact with the shadow, and we see mass demonstrations in which the collective energy can be manipulated both for good and ill. Suddenly, for some reason, the person or the shadow are no longer enough for human beings, and then comes the moment to make the leap, the unconscious connection with the soul. New values begin to emerge. And at the end of this process, if those new values are to become established, the entire race comes into contact with the symbols, the coded language by which present-day generations communicate with their ancestral knowledge. One of those symbols of rebirth is the navel. In the navel of Vishnu, the Indian divinity responsible for creation and destruction, sits the god who will rule each cycle. Yogis consider the navel one of the chakras, one of the sacred points on the human body. Primitive tribes often used to build monuments in the place that they believed to be the navel of the world. In South America, people who go into trances say that the true form of the human being is a luminous egg that connects with other people through filaments that emerge from the navel. The mandala, a design said to stimulate meditation, is a symbolic representation of this. I passed all this information on to Heron in England before the agreed date. I told him that the woman who had succeeded in provoking the same absurd reaction in a group of people must have enormous power, and that I wouldn't be surprised if she wasn't some kind of paranormal. I suggested that he study her more closely. I had never thought about the subject before, and I tried to forget it at once. However, my daughter said that I was behaving oddly, thinking only of myself, that I was, in short, navel-gazing. Deirdre O'Neill, known as Edda. It was a complete disaster. How could you have put the idea in my head that I could teach? Why humiliate me in front of other people? I should just forget you even exist. When I was taught to dance, I danced. When I was taught calligraphy, I practiced calligraphy. But demanding that I go so far beyond my limits was pure wickedness. That's why I caught the train up to Scotland. That's why I came here. So that you could see how much I hate you. She couldn't stop crying. Fortunately, she left the child with her parents, because she was talking rather too loudly and there was a faint whiff of wine on her breath. I asked her to come in. Making all that noise at my front door would do nothing to help my already somewhat tarnished reputation, with people putting it around that I received visits from both men and women and organised sex orgies in the name of Satan. But she still stood there, shouting, "It's all your fault! You humiliated me!" One window opened and then another. Well, anyone working to change the axis of the world must be prepared for the fact that her neighbours won't always be happy. I went over to Athena and did exactly what she wanted me to do. I put my arms around her. She continued weeping, her head resting on my shoulder. Very gently, I helped her up the steps and into the house. I made some tea, the recipe for which I share with no one because it was taught to me by my protector. I placed it in front of her and she drank it down in one gulp. By doing so, she demonstrated that her trust in me was still intact. "Why am I like this?" she asked. I knew then that the effects of the alcohol had been neutralized. "There are men who love me. I have a son who adores me and sees me as his model in life. I have adoptive parents whom I consider to be my real family and who would lay down their lives for me. I filled in all the blank spaces in my past when I went in search of my birth mother. I have enough money to spend the next 3 years doing nothing but enjoying life, and still I'm not content. I feel miserable and guilty because God blessed me with tragedies that I've managed to overcome and with miracles to which I've done credit. But I'm never content. I always want more. The last thing I needed was to go to that theater and add a failure to my list of victories." "Do you think you did the wrong thing?" She looked at me in surprise. "Why did you ask that?" I said nothing, but awaited her answer. "No, I did the right thing. I went there with a journalist friend, and I didn't have a clue what I was going to do, but suddenly things started to emerge as if out of the void. I felt the presence of the Great Mother by my side, guiding me, instructing me, filling my voice with a confidence I didn't really feel." "So, why are you complaining?" "Because no one understood." "Is that important? Important enough to make you travel up to Scotland and insult me in front of everyone?" "Of course it's important. If I can do absolutely anything and know I'm doing the right thing, how come I'm not at least loved and admired?" So that was the problem. I took her hand and led her into the same room where weeks before she had sat contemplating a candle. I asked her to sit down and try to calm herself a little, although I was sure the tea was already taking effect. I went to my room, picked up a round mirror, and placed it before her. "You have everything, and you fought for every inch of your territory. Now look at your tears. Look at your face and the bitterness etched on it. Look at the woman in the mirror. But don't laugh this time. Try to understand her. I allowed her time to follow my instructions. When I saw that she was, as I intended, going into a trance, I went on. What is the secret of life? We call it grace or blessing. Everyone struggles to be satisfied with what they have. Apart from me. Apart from you. Apart from a few people who will, alas, have to make a small sacrifice in the name of something greater. Our imagination is larger than the world around us. We go beyond our limits. This used to be called witchcraft, but fortunately things have changed. Otherwise we would both already have been burned at the stake. When they stopped burning women, science found an explanation for our behavior, normally referred to as female hysteria. We don't get burned anymore, but it does cause problems, especially in the workplace. But don't worry, eventually they'll call it wisdom. Keep looking into the mirror. Who can you see? A woman. And what is there beyond that woman? She hesitated. I asked again, and she said, another woman, more authentic and more intelligent than me. It's as if she were a soul that didn't belong to me, which is, nonetheless, part of me. Exactly. Now I'm going to ask you to imagine one of the most important symbols in alchemy. A snake forming a circle and swallowing its own tail. Can you imagine that? She nodded. That's what life is like for people like you and me. We're constantly destroying and rebuilding ourselves. Everything in your life has followed the same pattern. From lost to found. From divorce to new love. From working in a bank to selling real estate in the desert. Only one thing remains intact. Your son. He is the connecting thread, and you must respect that. She started to cry again, but her tears were different this time. You came here because you saw a female face in the flames. That face is the face you can see now in the mirror, so try to honor it. Don't let yourself be weighed down by what other people think, because in a few years, in a few decades, or in a few centuries, that way of thinking will have changed. Live now, what others will only live in the future. What do you want? You can't want to be happy, because that's too easy and too boring. You can't want only to love, because that's impossible. What do you want? You want to justify your life, to live it as intensely as possible. That is at once a trap and a source of ecstasy. Try to be alert to that danger and experience the joy and the adventure of being that woman who is beyond the image reflected in the mirror. Her eyes closed, but I knew that my words had penetrated her soul and would stay there. If you want to take a risk and continue teaching, do so. If you don't want to, know that you've already gone further than most other people. Her body began to relax. I held her in my arms until she fell asleep, her head on my breast. I tried to whisper a few more things to her because I'd been through the same stages, and I knew how difficult it was, just as my protector had told me it would be, and as I myself had found out through painful experience. However, the fact that it was difficult didn't make the experience any less interesting. What experience? Living as a human being and as a divinity. Moving from tension into relaxation. From relaxation into trance. From trance into a more intense contact with other people. From that contact back into tension and so on, like the serpent swallowing its own tail. It was no easy matter, mainly because it requires unconditional love, which does not fear suffering, rejection, loss. Whoever drinks this water once can never quench her thirst at other springs. Andrea McCain, actress. The other day you mentioned Gaia, who created herself and had a child without the help of a man. You said, quite rightly, that the Great Mother was eventually superseded by the male gods. But you forgot about Hera, a descendant of your favourite goddess. Hera is more important because she's more practical. She rules the skies and the earth, the seasons of the year and storms. According to the same Greeks you cited, the Milky Way that we see in the sky was created out of the milk that spurted forth from her breast. A beautiful breast, it must be said, because all-powerful Zeus changed himself into a bird purely in order to be able to have his way with her without being rejected. We were walking through a large department store in Knightsbridge. I'd phoned her, saying that I'd like to talk, and she'd invited me to the winter sales. It would have been far more pleasant to have a cup of tea together or lunch in some quiet restaurant. Your son could get lost in this crowd. Don't worry about him. Go on with what you were telling me. Hera discovered the trick and forced Zeus to marry her. Immediately after the ceremony, however, the great king of Olympus returned to his playboy lifestyle, seducing any woman, mortal or immortal, who happened by. Hera, however, remained faithful. Rather than blame her husband, she blamed the women for their loose behaviour. Isn't that what we all do? I didn't know what she meant, and so I carried on talking as if I hadn't heard what she'd said. Then she decided to give him a taste of his own medicine and find a god or a man to take to her bed. Look, couldn't we stop for a while and have a coffee? But Athena had just gone into a lingerie shop. Do you think this is pretty? She asked, holding up a provocative flesh-coloured bra and panty set. Yes, very. Will anyone see it if you wear it? Of course. Or do you think I'm a saint? But go on with what you were saying about Hera. Zeus was horrified by her behaviour, but Hera was leading an independent life, and she didn't give two hoots about her marriage. Have you really got a boyfriend? Yes. I'd never seen him. She went over to the checkout, paid for the lingerie, and put it in her bag. Virel's hungry, and I'm sure he's not the slightest bit interested in Greek myths, so hurry up and finish Hera's story. It has a rather silly ending. Zeus, afraid of losing his beloved, pretended that he was getting married again. When Hera found out, she saw that things had gone too far. Lovers were one thing, but divorce was unthinkable. Nothing new there, then. She decided to go to the ceremony and kick up a fuss, and it was only then that she realised Zeus was marrying a statue. What did Hera do? She roared with laughter. That broke the ice between them, and she became once more the queen of the skies. Great. So if that ever happens to you... What? If your man gets himself another woman, don't forget to laugh. I'm not a goddess. I'd be much more vengeful. Anyway, why is it I've never seen your boyfriend? Because he's always busy. Where did you meet him? At the bank where I used to work. He had an account there, and now, if you don't mind, my son's waiting for me. You're right. If I don't keep my eye on him, he could get lost among all these people. By the way, we're having a meeting at my place next week. You're invited, of course. Yes, and I know who organised it. Athena kissed me lightly on both cheeks and left. At least she'd got the message. That afternoon at the theatre, the director made a point of telling me that he was annoyed because, he said, I'd arranged for a group of actors to go and visit that woman. I explained that it hadn't been my idea. Heron had become obsessed with the subject of navels and had asked me if some of the other actors would be prepared to continue the interrupted lecture. That said, I added, it was my choice to ask them. Of course it was, but the last thing I wanted was for him to go to Athena's house alone. The actors had all arrived, but instead of another read-through of the new play, the director decided to change the programme. Today we'll do another exercise in psychodrama. Editor's note, a therapeutic technique that involves people acting out their personal experiences. There was no need. We all knew how the characters would behave in the situations described by the playwright. Can I suggest a subject? Everyone turned to look at me. The director seemed surprised. What's this? A revolt? No, listen. We create a situation where a man, after great difficulty, manages to get a group of people together to celebrate an important ritual in the community. Something let's say, like the autumn harvest. Meanwhile, a strange woman arrives, and because of her beauty and the various rumours circulating about her being a goddess in disguise, for example, the group the man has formed in order to keep alive the traditions in his village breaks up, and its members all go off to see the woman instead. "But that's got nothing to do with the play we're rehearsing," said one of the actresses. The director, however, had understood what I was driving at. "That's an excellent idea. Let's begin." And turning to me, he said, "Andrea, you can be the new arrival. That way you can get a better understanding of the situation in the village. And I'll be the decent man trying to preserve the old ways. The group will be made up of couples who go to church, get together on Saturdays to do work in the community, and generally help one another." We lay down on the floor, did some relaxation, and then began the exercise proper, which was really very simple. The main character, in this case me, created various situations and the others reacted to them. When the relaxation was over, I transformed myself into Athena. In my fantasy, she roamed the world like Satan in search of subjects for her realm, but she disguised herself as Gaia, the goddess who knows everything and created everything. For 15 minutes, the other actors paired up into couples, got to know each other, and invented a common history involving children, farms, understanding, and friendship. When I felt this little universe was ready, I sat at one corner of the stage and began to speak about love. "Here we are in this little village, and you think I'm a stranger, which is why you're interested in what I have to tell you. You've never travelled and don't know what goes on beyond the mountains. But I can tell you. There's no need to praise the earth. The earth will always be generous with this community. The important thing is to praise human beings. You say you'd love to travel, but you misuse the word love. Love is a relationship between people. Your one desire is for the harvest to be a good one, and that's why you've decided to love the earth. More nonsense. Love isn't desire or knowledge or admiration. It's a challenge. It's an invisible fire. That's why, if you think I'm a stranger on this earth, you're wrong. Everything is familiar to me because I come in strength and in fire, and when I leave, no one will be the same. I bring true love, not the love they write about in books or in fairy tales." The husband of one of the couples began looking at me. His wife became distraught. During the rest of the exercise, the director, or rather the decent man, did all he could to explain the importance of maintaining traditions, praising the earth, and asking the earth to be as generous this year as it had been last year. I spoke only of love. "He says the earth needs rituals. Well, I can guarantee that if there's love enough among you, you'll have an abundant harvest, because love is the feeling that transforms everything. But what do I see? Friendship. Passion died out a long time ago because you've all got used to one another. That's why the earth gives only what it gave last year, neither more nor less. And that's why, in the darkness of your souls, you silently complain that nothing in your lives changes. Why? Because you've always tried to control the force that transforms everything so that your lives can carry on without being faced by any major challenges." The decent man explained, "Our community has survived because we've always respected the laws by which even love itself is guided. Anyone who falls in love without taking into account the common good will be condemned to live in constant fear of hurting his partner, of irritating his new love, of losing everything he built. A stranger with no ties and no history can say what she likes, but she doesn't know how hard it was to get where we are now. She doesn't know the sacrifices we made for our children. She doesn't know that we work tirelessly so that the earth will be generous with us, so that we will be at peace, and so that we can store away provisions for the future." For an hour, I defended the passion that devours everything, while the decent man spoke of the feeling that brings peace and tranquility. In the end, I was left talking to myself while the whole community gathered around him. I'd played my role with great gusto and with a conviction I didn't even know I felt. Despite everything, though, the stranger left the village without having convinced anyone. And that made me very, very happy.